They laughed before she even opened her mouth. Because at Fort Benning, Georgia, a place built on pride and polished boots, nothing drew sharper ridicule than someone who didn't look like they belonged. And Emily Carter, stepping out of a rattling pickup that coughed more smoke than a campfire, looked like she had wandered in from another world. Her jeans were faded, her shirt worn thin, her boots cracked and uneven, and her backpack sagged from a single frayed strap. And as she walked across the yard filled with America's most confident recruits, men and women with family names engraved on military history, athletes who traded trophies for rifles, dreamers convinced they were destined for glory, her silence became a target sharper than any insult. And Brad Miller, the golden boy with a smirk as wide as his shoulders, shoved past her with mock pity, his voice echoing loud. "Careful, sweetheart. Those boots belong in a museum." And Tiffany Clark, blonde ponytail swinging, added venom with a laugh. "Who let the janitor in? This isn't the soup kitchen." And the crowd roared as if cruelty was the morning anthem. But Emily didn't flinch, didn't raise her eyes, just squared her shoulders and walked on with that unnerving calm that made her mockers louder, because silence often frightens the arrogant more than anger. Later in the mess hall, when Jason Reed clattered his tray on her table and jeered, "Lost your way to community service." "Carter," she answered only, "I'm eating." 2 words spoken with steady eyes that rattled him more than any clever comeback, and when he flicked potatoes across her shirt, the laughter of the room was cut by confusion as Emily wiped them clean with quiet precision and kept eating as if humiliation had no teeth. And by evening drills, while others shouted bravado and struggled through push-ups and sprints, Emily moved like steady clockwork, not leading, not faltering, her breathing calm, her gaze fixed. And though Brad barked insults when her shoelaces came undone and Tiffany whispered mockery to her friends, Colonel David Harris, the seasoned officer with decades of wars in his eyes, watched her longer than most, seeing something unusual in the way she carried herself, something unshaken beneath the surface. And as the sun set over the red Georgia clay, the recruits were convinced they had found their weak link, a charity case, a girl too ordinary to survive among elites. But Emily knew what they could never guess, that she wasn't there to impress them, that beneath the quiet and the worn clothes and the silence lay a truth none of them were prepared for, a truth etched in ink across her back, a truth that in a matter of days would bring this entire camp to its knees. The next morning the air was thick with dew, the Georgia clay damp beneath their boots, and the recruits lined up for endurance training that promised to break the weak and elevate the strong. And as the whistle blew, bodies hit the dirt for push-ups, lungs burned on sprints, and sweat poured like rain, yet all eyes seemed to drift toward Emily Carter, the quiet woman who ran in boots that barely held together, her shoelaces fraying, her steps steady but unhurried. And Brad Miller, determined to keep his throne as the alpha, jogged alongside her just long enough to sneer, "Shoes giving up, Carter, or is it just you?" Loud enough for the pack to laugh. Then he slammed his shoulder into her, sending her stumbling into the mud, and as laughter rippled across the formation, Emily rose without a word, brushed mud from her palms, and fell back into line, her silence heavier than any insult. And when the run ended with sweat and aching limbs, Captain Harris barked out names, pointing at Emily for extra laps because she had slipped formation when Brad shoved her. And though the injustice burned in the eyes of Maria Lopez, the only cadet who dared to notice, Emily accepted the punishment without a word, circling the track while others drank water, her limp faint but her resolve unbroken, until her breath came in short, controlled bursts, and her shirt clung to her skin. And when Tiffany Clark tossed an empty bottle at her feet with a cruel laugh, "Hydrate with air," Emily simply crushed it in her hand and dropped it in the trash, her face calm, her silence again the sharpest answer. That night in the barracks, as voices rose with stories of conquest and arrogance, Jason Reed strutted to Emily's bunk with his phone ready, his friends smirking in the background, and with theatrical flair he jeered, "Still think you belong here, Carter? Or are you just here to fold laundry?" And the others chuckled, waiting for her to snap, waiting for tears, but Emily only looked at him, her brown eyes calm, her voice soft, "I'm here to train," and her words, so plain and steady, silenced the room more than shouting ever could. And Jason, embarrassed, flicked her blanket to the floor while recording, earning laughs, Yet when Emily picked it up with slow, deliberate hands and lay back down, refusing to give them the reaction they craved, something unsettled them, because cruelty without effect feels like striking a stone wall. Days passed and the humiliation escalated, Brad blocking her path in the yard, Tiffany tossing petty insults, Jason filming each attempt at mockery, and Marcus Webb in the night drill yanking ropes from her hands to earn a laugh, kicking dirt into her face as explosions flared and orders were shouted. But every time Emily reset, retied, rebuilt, her fingers moving with the precise calm of someone who had done harder things in darker places. And once, when Marcus sneered, "Keep trying, princess," Emily looked up with a voice quiet yet cutting. "You done?" And the way her eyes met his made him falter, his laughter hollow as he turned away. But even Maria, who had offered Emily a spare map during navigation drills, whispered in awe after watching Emily disassemble and reassemble an M4 in 52 seconds flat, faster and cleaner than even the instructors expected. You weren't hiding because you were weak. You were hiding because you were dangerous. And though Emily said nothing, the flicker in her eyes betrayed that truth, because every act of silence was not submission but restraint. Every humiliation endured was not weakness but a mask, and though the recruits did not yet know it, each cruel word and shove was forging the moment when the truth would tear through their illusions, for legends do not need to announce themselves. They only need to wait until arrogance writes its own downfall. By the third week at Fort Benning, the bravado of the recruits had begun to fray. Uniforms once crisp, now stained with sweat and dirt. Voices once loud, now edged with fatigue. Yet Emily Carter moved through each drill with the same unnerving steadiness that had defined her since day one. And it was during the weapons test that the tide began to shift, because while most recruits fumbled with pins and cursed as springs bounced across the table, Emily's hands moved like clockwork. Each motion precise, pin out, bolt removed, parts laid in perfect order, reassembled in 52 seconds flat, the instructor, Sergeant Walker, staring at the timer, then at Emily, as if questioning whether the device was broken, and when he muttered, "That's Special Forces, steady." The room fell silent for a moment before Brad Miller scoffed. "So she can clean a gun. Doesn't mean she can fight," his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, but beneath his bravado flickered the unease of a man who sensed his crown slipping. Later at the shooting range, while Tiffany missed 2 targets and Brad cursed at a near miss, Emily lay prone, her breathing slow, her body still. And without adjusting the scope or testing the wind, she fired 5 shots in clean succession, each one striking dead center, the range officer blinking at the target, then back at her weapon, realizing the sights had been deliberately misaligned, a flaw that should have made accuracy impossible. Yet she had compensated with instinct alone, and whispers ran down the firing line like wildfire, recruits nudging each other, some eyes widening, others narrowing with suspicion. Because this was not beginner's luck. This was the calm efficiency of someone who had lived with weapons long before they had touched one. That evening in the mess hall, Jason Reed replayed the shooting on his phone, muttering theories. Tiffany hissed about lucky shots, and Brad slammed his tray down harder than necessary. But Maria Lopez, the only one who had dared to show Emily kindness, leaned in close and whispered, "Nobody does that without years of training." And Emily, chewing slowly, gave no answer, her eyes steady on the table, but inside the weight of her secret pressed heavier, because every demonstration of skill tightened the noose she had drawn around her own anonymity. The instructors noticed too, their glances lingering, their tone shifting from disdain to cautious curiosity, and Colonel Harris, who had dismissed her as supply crew on the first day, now watched her in briefings with a calculating eye, occasionally asking her opinion on navigation routes or tactical formations, gestures so subtle most recruits missed them, but Brad did not, and each nod in Emily's direction felt like a challenge to his dominance, his pride bruised deeper than any wound on the field. The breaking point came during a night exercise when cadets were tasked with setting up defensive perimeters under simulated fire, flares painting the sky red and orders flying like bullets. And Marcus Webb, always eager to humiliate, yanked the rope from Emily's hands and tossed it into the mud with a mocking, "Oops, guess you're not cut out for this." Yet when Emily knelt, picked it up, and tied the barrier again with hands steady despite the chaos, Marcus sneered, kicked dirt on her fingers, and muttered, "Keep trying, princess." But when she looked up, her voice quiet and razor-sharp. "You done?" He blinked, faltered, and turned away, and though he laughed to save face, by morning his own barrier had collapsed, costing his squad valuable points, and while no one saw Emily near it, Maria allowed herself a faint smile, knowing accidents rarely followed such patterns. Rumors spread faster than wildfire now, whispered in bunks and bathrooms, recruits wondering who Emily Carter really was, why her silence unsettled them, how a woman who dressed like she belonged in a bus station could fire like a sniper and move like water. And though they didn't yet know it, the legend was already breathing beneath her skin, waiting for the moment when arrogance would collide with truth in a way no one at Fort Benning would ever forget. By the 4th week at Fort Benning, the true purpose of the training revealed itself, not just to build muscle but to strip away pride. And while many recruits groaned under the weight of exhaustion, Emily Carter endured each trial with the same unshaken composure, and it was during the brutal 10-mile terrain run across the rough Georgia landscape that her quiet resilience became impossible to ignore, because while others surged forward in packs, shouting and urging each other on, Emily kept a steady rhythm, her breathing controlled, her eyes fixed ahead, never faltering even when the mud sucked at her boots or the sun beat down like a hammer. And Brad Miller, unwilling to let her pass without humiliation, brushed her elbow hard enough to twist her balance, sending her stumbling into a jagged patch of ground where her ankle bent wrong. Yet instead of crying out or grasping for sympathy, Emily clenched her jaw, pulled herself up, and limped back into formation, only to hear Captain Harris's voice thunder across the line. "Mitchell! Broke formation. Squad loses points." His use of her last name carrying the weight of judgment, and the squad groaned in frustration while Brad smirked in triumph. But Emily said nothing. She simply ran, her ankle throbbing with every step, her limp barely noticeable as she finished the course. And when it ended, Harris ordered 5 extra laps. Punishment meant to break her spirit, yet she completed each one, sweat pouring, face pale, but never slowing. And when Tiffany Clark tossed an empty bottle at her feet with that cruel laugh, "Hydrate with air," Emily crushed it in her hand and dropped it in the bin, silence again her sharpest blade. That night in the barracks, while others nursed sore muscles and traded stories of glory, Emily sat alone on her narrow bunk, pulling from her bag a creased photograph of herself as a younger woman standing beside a man whose face was blurred but whose posture spoke volumes, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, the unmistakable bearing of authority. And as she traced her finger over the image, a flicker of memory crossed her expression, grief, perhaps regret. But she tucked it away quickly when footsteps approached, for secrets had no place in a barracks where gossip traveled faster than gunfire. By morning, her ankle still ached, yet she showed no weakness on the training field, climbing walls, crawling under barbed wire, enduring push-ups until her arms shook. And though Brad and Jason hurled jeers, "Our charity case is still here. Unbelievable." Their words bounced off her like stones thrown at steel, because Emily had learned long ago that pain was temporary but composure was forever. And Maria Lopez, running beside her, whispered with quiet awe, "How do you not break?" And Emily's answer was simple, "I've already been broken. This is nothing." Words spoken so softly, Maria nearly doubted she heard them, yet the conviction in her eyes silenced any doubt. By the time the night combat drill arrived, with flares lighting the sky and instructors barking contradictory orders, the recruits were raw with fatigue, and Emily once again became the target of Marcus Webb's petty cruelty, as he yanked the rope she was tying and kicked dirt onto her hands. But when she looked at him with those steady eyes and asked, "You done?" his smirk faltered, because even bullies sense when they're standing too close to a storm, and though no one said it aloud, more than a few recruits began to wonder what kind of storm Emily Carter was hiding. Still, the laughter lingered, the cruelty continued, but beneath it grew unease, because no one could explain how she endured so much without cracking, how she absorbed humiliation, injury, punishment, and still moved forward with that unnerving calm. And the truth, though hidden under torn boots and faded shirts, was waiting for the moment when silence would give way to revelation, and when that moment came, it would rewrite everything they thought they knew about weakness, strength, and the woman they had so carelessly dismissed. The confrontation came on a crisp morning when the combat simulation was announced. Hand-to-hand matches, no weapons, no excuses, just raw skill. And fate paired Emily Carter against Brad Miller, the golden boy who had mocked her from day one, towering over her small frame with fists clenched and arrogance blazing, and as the whistle blew he wasted no time, charging forward like a bull, slamming her against the padded wall so hard that the fabric of her shirt tore from her shoulder down her back, and laughter erupted from Tiffany Clark and Jason Reed, who raised their phones to capture what they thought would be her final humiliation. But in that instant, everything shifted, because as Emily steadied herself, the torn cloth slid lower, and ink etched across her shoulder blade caught the morning light. A coiled viper wrapped around a shattered skull, fangs dripping venom, a mark whispered of in military folklore. One said to belong only to the chosen protege of a man thought long dead, Ghost Viper, and silence fell like a hammer, laughter dying mid-breath. Even Brad's triumphant grin faltering as he stared at the tattoo with confusion shading into fear, and then Colonel David Harris, who had been watching from across the yard, froze, his face draining of color, his voice trembling as he stepped forward. "Who gave you the right to wear that mark?" And Emily, back straight despite Brad's grip still on her torn shirt, looked at him with calm eyes and said, "I didn't ask for it. It was given to me by Ghost Viper himself. I trained under him for 6 years." And the words rippled through the crowd like an explosion, recruits exchanging shocked glances, instructors stiffening, and Colonel Harris, moved by recognition and awe, snapped into a salute so sharp it cut the air, his voice firm. "No one bears that tattoo unless they are his final student, his only student," and the weight of his salute crashed into the recruits harder than any blow. Tiffany's phone slipping from nerveless fingers, Jason lowering his camera in disbelief, and Brad stumbling back as if struck, his arrogance crumbling beneath the revelation. Yet pride refused to surrender, and he snarled, "I don't care what ink you've got or what story you tell, prove it in a real fight." And though Colonel Harris barked a warning, Brad lunged again, fists swinging with rage. But Emily didn't flinch, didn't raise her guard in panic. She simply moved, flowing around his strikes like water around rocks. Her footwork so subtle it looked effortless, until Brad, red-faced and panting, overextended on a wild punch, and in that heartbeat Emily stepped in, her arms sliding around his neck like an embrace, locking into a sleeper hold executed with surgical precision, and within seconds Brad collapsed, unconscious before his body even hit the floor, the entire yard holding its breath as silence pressed down heavy, and Captain Harris, after a long pause, spoke with absolute authority. Effective immediately, Emily Carter is designated an honorary instructor. You will learn from her, respect her, follow her orders as you would mine, and the recruits parted as Emily pulled her torn shirt closed and walked toward the barracks, their eyes lowered, their laughter dead. The camp transformed in an instant from a place of mockery to one of stunned reverence, because in one brutal moment they had seen the truth. The woman they dismissed as nothing had revealed herself as something far greater than any of them could comprehend. The shift at Fort Benning was immediate and irreversible, for word of what had happened on the training yard spread faster than wildfire, whispered in chow lines, echoed in bunks, carried by shaky cell phone videos before commanders confiscated them. Yet the damage was already done because every recruit, every instructor, every staff member now knew that Emily Carter, the quiet woman mocked as a charity case, bore the mark of Ghost Viper and had dropped Brad Miller in less than 8 seconds without throwing a single punch, and where once laughter followed her like a shadow, now silence did, recruits parting in corridors, lowering their eyes when she passed, their earlier arrogance collapsing under the weight of truth, and even Captain Harris, the man who had dismissed her on her first day as supply crew, began addressing her with a new formality, pausing in briefings to ask her opinion, and though Emily responded with the same calm brevity, the shift was undeniable, because respect, once withheld, had been earned in a way none of them could challenge. Brad Miller, once untouchable, was confined to the medical unit after his defeat, his name whispered not with admiration but as a warning, a case study in arrogance undone, and Tiffany Clark, whose sneering commentary had filled the air for weeks, found her own words weaponized against her when command reviewed drone footage of her deliberate disobedience during a live fire exercise, stripping her of points, assigning her to latrine duty, and turning her smirk into a pale mask of humiliation, while Jason Reed, who had built his identity on recording cruelty, had his privileges revoked, reassigned to kitchen patrol, the same phone that had once been his weapon now locked away in an instructor's drawer. The camp itself shifted beneath the weight of these reckonings, because the story of Emily Carter was no longer just gossip but curriculum, whispered by officers as a living lesson about the danger of judging by appearance, and Maria Lopez, who had shown kindness when no one else dared, was quietly recognized. Her name put forward for advanced training as mentors noted her rare ability to see past surface impressions, and within days Emily was given command of a small team for the urban assault course, her squad, ironically including Tiffany, who rolled her eyes but obeyed, her defiance muted by the knowledge that drone footage captured everything, and when Tiffany ignored Emily's signal and triggered a tripwire that set off alarms, it was Captain Harris himself who stormed over, furious. But when Tiffany lied with theatrical innocence, "I didn't see any signal," the instructors replayed the overhead footage in front of everyone, exposing her deceit, and Harris docked her squad 50 points, sentencing her to another week of punishment. The recruits watching in silence as the hierarchy they once trusted was dismantled, replaced by something new, something harder and fairer. And though Emily never gloated, never even raised her voice, the camp itself bent around her, her presence a constant reminder that strength does not always wear the face you expect. At night, the barracks buzzed with uneasy talk, some recruits awed, others afraid, a few even resentful, but none dared mock her anymore. And in the quiet corners, Maria leaned close and whispered, "You've changed this place," to which Emily only shook her head and said, "They changed themselves." But she knew better. She knew that humility forged under pressure could reshape even the proudest soul, and so the camp carried on, drills and marches, weapons and maps. But beneath it all, a new current ran, one of caution, respect, and a strange reverence for the woman who had arrived in worn boots and a battered truck, the woman who had endured every insult without striking back, until the day came when truth revealed itself and forced them all to see her for who she truly was. It happened quietly at first, a whisper that someone important was at the gate. A murmur passed from recruit to recruit until even the instructors stiffened, and then Colonel David Harris himself entered the yard with a formality that made every cadet straighten their backs, his voice carrying across the air, Carter, front and center, and Emily, wiping her hands after cleaning her rifle, stood and followed, her expression calm but her eyes flickering with the faintest trace of something unreadable. And as she walked through the base, the recruits watched from windows and doorways, their curiosity swelling like a tide, until at the main gate she saw him, a tall man in civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a black tactical jacket that looked deceptively casual, his stride controlled, his presence radiating decades of command. And though the guards at the gate stood uneasy, it was Colonel Harris's salute that confirmed his identity. "Cadets, this is General William Carter," the name striking like a thunderclap across the yard, and the recruits froze, whispering furiously, recognizing the name that carried weight in every military circle, yet none were prepared for what came next, because when Emily stopped just feet from him, her expression softened in a way no one had ever seen, and he looked at her with relief, almost tenderness, before placing a steady hand on her shoulder, the same shoulder that bore the Black Viper tattoo, and said with quiet certainty, "Yeah, I had to come." And as the crowd strained to understand, Colonel Harris cleared his throat, his tone formal but shaking with the gravity of revelation. "Recruits, General Carter is not only here in his official capacity, he is also Emily's husband." And the words detonated across the base like a blast, Tiffany Clark staggering backward, Jason Reed's jaw falling open, Maria Lopez's eyes widening in shock despite her faith in Emily, and Brad Miller, pale from his previous defeat, muttering a curse under his breath as though the ground itself had betrayed him, and the whispers became a roar. Cadets grappling with the impossibility that the quiet woman they had mocked was not only the legendary student of Ghost Viper, but the wife of one of the most powerful generals in the United States military, a truth that stripped them of every excuse and burned their arrogance to ash. Yet Emily said nothing. She let the storm rage around her, simply standing beside William Carter as he guided her toward the battered pickup truck that had once been the butt of so many jokes. And when the engine roared to life louder than expected, the recruits stood frozen, watching as the dust rose behind the vehicle and carried her away, their silence heavier than words. For in that moment the base realized that some stories were bigger than they could grasp. Some people carried truths that dwarfed their judgments, and the name Emily Carter was no longer just a cadet on a roster but a legend that had walked through their lives, leaving them to reckon with what it meant to underestimate someone who had been extraordinary all along. The fallout came swiftly, as if the revelation of Emily Carter's true identity had set off a chain reaction no one could stop. For within 72 hours, Brad Miller was summoned before a review board, his attack on what was now known to be a classified operative deemed conduct unbecoming of a soldier. And though his family name had once carried weight, no influence could shield him from disgrace, and the verdict was brutal, discharged, stripped of honor, his dreams of special forces glory dissolving into the cautionary tale whispered across the base. While Tiffany Clark's punishment arrived in a more public form, the videos she and her friends had gleefully recorded of mocking Emily resurfacing on social media, alongside the news that Emily Carter was connected to General William Carter and the legendary Ghost Viper, and within days, Tiffany's defense contractor sponsor cut ties, releasing a statement about values incompatible with our mission, leaving her humiliated and exposed, her once-admired accounts flooded with outrage until she deleted them all. But the internet never forgets, and her name lingered in screenshots like a scar. Jason Reed fared little better. His role in taunting and recording cruelty noted in his record, his privileges stripped, his duties reduced to the most grueling labor the camp could devise, scrubbing kitchens, hauling equipment, and cleaning latrines under the Georgia sun, until even his cocky grin faded into silence, and Marcus Webb, who had sabotaged Emily during drills, was reassigned to remedial training, his once booming laugh now muted under the weight of ridicule from peers who no longer admired his antics. Yet perhaps the most surprising transformation came from Captain Harris himself, for though he had been the one to dismiss Emily at first sight, his quiet meeting with senior leadership ended with mandatory retraining on respect and leadership, and his demeanor shifted from harsh dismissal to careful thoughtfulness, no longer barking orders as though recruits were tools, but pausing to weigh his words. And though the cadets whispered about his humiliation, they also noticed the change spreading through the entire command structure. Because Emily Carter's story had become more than gossip, it was now doctrine, her name appearing in lesson plans for new recruits. Her example used to teach the dangers of arrogance and the power of resilience. And Maria Lopez, whose small kindness had stood out in the storm of cruelty, found herself recognized, invited to advanced programs, praised by commanders who valued her ability to see beyond the surface, a reminder that compassion itself was a form of strength. The culture of the camp shifted with her rise, the mess hall quieter, the barracks more respectful, jokes that once circled like vultures now replaced by hesitant conversations about discipline and humility. And at night, when recruits lay in bunks staring at the ceiling, the story of Emily Carter replayed in their minds, the woman in scuffed boots who never raised her voice, who endured mockery with silence, who revealed herself only when pushed beyond reason, and left them all changed. And even weeks after she and General Carter drove away in that battered pickup, the places she had touched became monuments. The corner table in the mess hall where she ate alone, the patch of ground where Brad had fallen unconscious, the wall where Colonel Harris had offered an unprecedented salute, all whispered about as if they were sacred ground, and the lesson lingered like a shadow. Strength does not shout, it waits, and when it finally speaks, the world has no choice but to listen. Months passed after Emily Carter and General William Carter disappeared from Fort Benning, the dust of their departure settling into silence. But the story did not fade. Instead, it grew, whispered from cadet to cadet, told in quiet corners of mess halls, retold as lesson and warning, until Emily became less a woman than a symbol. Yet while recruits carried on with training and instructors reshaped their programs, elsewhere the past stirred restlessly, and it began with a phone ringing in a secure facility 2,000 miles away. A simple device encrypted beyond comprehension, answered by a woman whose eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had seen too much, and the voice on the other end spoke two words that froze her blood. Code Phoenix. The the codename tied to the final mission of Ghost Viper, the mission the world believed had killed him and his unit, the mission Emily herself had survived. And though she whispered, "I thought Phoenix was terminated," the reply was grim. "So did we, but intelligence suggests otherwise. The target is alive, and he knows about you." And Emily, standing in the dim light of her small cabin where William Carter read classified reports by lamplight, closed her eyes as the weight of inevitability settled over her shoulders, and when the line went dead, William looked up, reading her expression instantly, for both of them had known peace would not last, and with a steady nod he said, "I'll make the arrangements," as if the wheels of destiny had been waiting all along. But before she could prepare, another call came, younger, sharper, more urgent. "Mitchell, this is Agent Sarah Chen, Defense Intelligence. 3 deep-cover operatives vanished in Eastern Europe. They managed to transmit one word before disappearing, Viper," and Emily's silence stretched heavy before she answered, "I need 48 hours." To which the reply came cold, "You have 24. And the line cut, leaving her staring at the phone with a calm face but storming thoughts. For the ghost of her past, the mentor who had marked her as his last student, was no longer buried in legend but moving again in the shadows, as she packed hidden equipment from compartments built into the cabin walls, false identities, encrypted comms, weapons maintained despite her hopes of never needing them again. William watched, his expression grave but unsurprised, knowing the gentle peace they had shared was melting into steel. And when Emily finally paused at the window, looking out at the quiet landscape, she murmured, "The past never stays buried, does it?" And William's hand found hers, steady, his voice low. "No, but maybe some ghosts are meant to be faced." And though her face betrayed no fear, in her chest burned the truth, that the story which had begun in the mud of Fort Benning was not an ending at all, but the prelude to something larger, a fight where underestimation would no longer come from naive cadets but from enemies who dealt in shadows. And as the night deepened around their sanctuary, the Viper's mark on her back seemed to thrum with new life, a reminder that silence, restraint, and hidden strength were not just weapons in training yards but shields and blades, in a world where survival itself might hinge on the woman everyone once thought insignificant. Autumn had returned by the time Emily Carter stood on the porch of her hidden cabin, the wind carrying the smell of pine and earth, and though the world around her seemed quiet, inside she knew the silence was temporary, for shadows had begun moving again, and the call of Code Phoenix echoed louder with each passing hour. Yet she felt no panic, only the familiar calm that came when she accepted what life demanded, because she had learned long ago that fear is wasted breath and composure is its own armor. And as she looked out across the tree line, William Carter joined her, his presence steady, his voice low. "They'll come soon," and she nodded, her fingers brushing the scarred wood of the railing, her answer simple, "Then we'll be ready." And in that moment the batter-epped pickup truck parked nearby looked less like a relic and more like a symbol, proof that strength often hides in ordinary things, just as it had hidden in her when Fort Benning laughed at her scuffed boots and torn shirt. And now those same recruits, scattered across units and commands, carried her memory like a talisman, a reminder that arrogance blinds and silence reveals. And some told the story to new soldiers, others to their children, but always with the same conclusion. Never underestimate the quiet one, for she might carry the storm you cannot see. And though Emily packed her gear with methodical precision, sliding knives into sheaths and loading magazines with steady hands, her thoughts drifted not to vengeance but to the lesson she had left behind at the training yard, that respect is earned, not given, that freedom means standing tall even when you shake, and that true resilience is not found in the roar of triumph but in the quiet endurance of those who refuse to break. And as night settled around the cabin, headlights appeared down the dirt road, a black SUV rolling toward them with deliberate pace, and Emily exhaled once, calm and measured, before stepping off the porch, William at her side, both of them walking into the unknown with heads high, because peace had ended but purpose had returned, and the world beyond the trees waited for the kind of strength that hides in plain sight. And perhaps one day the recruits who once mocked her would understand that the most powerful statement she ever made was the one she never intended to make at all, the statement of living proof that legends are not built on noise but on the quiet choices that echo long after the laughter dies. And as this chapter closed and another opened, her story remained a mirror for us all, reminding us not to judge by appearances, not to surrender to cruelty, but to look deeper, endure longer, and believe that even in silence we hold the power to change the world. So if you've carried her lesson tonight, ask yourself, who around you carries a storm behind quiet eyes? And will you recognize their strength before the moment comes when the truth can no longer be ignored?